Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. I'd just like to check that you can hear me. So if you can, could you please type into the chat? Great, fantastic. Okay, so welcome to today's webinar. This is the first in a new series, and it's aimed at teachers in Australia and New Zealand. So we're very pleased that you are all able to join us. I can see lots of names coming into the chat. That's fantastic. So my name is Craig Thane, and I will be presenting today's webinar. Nigel McQuitty and Steve McIver from Cambridge University Press will be moderating the webinar behind the scenes. So if you're having a technical issue, you can ask for help in the Q&A box. So you would need to click on the Q&A box and you can type your question or your query there if you're having any technical issues. And Nigel and Steve will try to assist you. For today's session, I will share my PowerPoint presentation. You can see the opening page on screen now. This means that you will see the slides, but you won't be able to see me. During the webinar, there will be some small tasks, and these will be presented as polls where you can select an answer. So a little poll box will come up on screen and you'll be able to select your answer. Finally, there will be a question and answer session at the end of the webinar. So you can type your questions into the Q&A and I will read and answer the questions at the end of the session. So you can use the Q&A for technical issues, but you can also use the Q&A box for any questions that you've got about the content, any ideas that you want to follow up with as far as the content of the webinar is concerned. Okay, so I think that's all we need to cover in terms of housekeeping. So let's get underway with the webinar itself. So what I want to look at this afternoon is we're looking at this idea of getting grammar off the page. So first of all, we'll look at teachers' different attitudes towards teaching grammar. We'll then examine student preferences about learning grammar, so looking at teaching and the learning of grammar. I also just want to quickly cover how grammar is dealt with in course books. And then beyond that, we'll look at a little bit of theoretical background, methodological theory, in terms of the teaching of grammar and how that's historically been perceived or viewed. And then in the last third of the webinar, I want to look at or share some practical ideas with you for focusing on grammar in a slightly different way. Okay, so let's start with a task, and here we'll be looking at teachers' attitudes towards teaching grammar. So what I've got on screen here, there are 4 comments made by teachers. These are not direct lifts, but they're kind of representative of things that I've heard in staff rooms over the years. And I think they represent different points of view, different attitudes that teachers might have to teaching grammar. So number 1, I don't feel I've taught anything unless I presented a meaty piece of grammar. Number 2, students don't need grammar, they need to learn to communicate. Number 3, sure, it's important, but you've got to mix it up with other stuff, skills, work, vocabulary. Number 4, when it comes to grammar, I like to make sure I cover everything with students. So Steve, if you could launch the poll, what I'd like you to do is if you could select the attitude or the comment which is closest to your point of view. Maybe it doesn't mirror it exactly, but it's close. Okay, thank you for your answers. All right. Okay, so that's interesting. I think number 3 is by quite a long way the most popular of these 4 comments. So we'll stop the poll there. And if we I'll just get rid of that. Good. And if we look at teacher attitudes, we can really look at them in terms of a continuum. And there are those at one end of the continuum who see the teaching of grammar as a waste of time. Teachers who have this kind of point of view would see that getting students to communicate and getting them to engage with communicative tasks is much more beneficial for them. And then at the other end of the continuum, you've got teachers who feel that it's absolutely essential to cover grammar. And if not, students won't make progress in terms of their language competence. But I think the results of the poll are kind of indicative in the sense that a lot of teachers feel that, that they're kind of somewhere maybe in the middle of this continuum. Okay, so let's move on now to look at students. So again, these are four kind of representative comments that I've heard or watched students say or do over the years in terms of how they feel about learning grammar. So there are comments and behaviors described here. So number one, oh no, not grammar again. Number two, yes, it'll be useful to know how to use the present perfect correctly. Number three, but teacher, you've missed lesson 5, it focuses on grammar. And number 4, a silent look of terror. Okay, so what I'd like you to do is think of a group of learners that you've taught maybe in the last year or so. I mean, clearly within groups, there are a lot of different attitudes towards grammar. So what I'd like you to do, but what often happens is that a group will actually sort of end up having a kind of an attitude, a prevalent attitude in terms of, so which of these is most prevalent in a group that you've taught in the last year or so, a group that you remember? Okay. So I've noted in the chat that some of you weren't able to see the poll results last time round. So I'll just run through those now for this particular poll. So 16% have chosen comment number 1, oh no, not grammar again. 67% chose number 2, yes, it'll be useful to use the present perfect correctly. 4%, but teacher, you've missed lesson 5, it focuses on grammar. And 13% silent look of terror. Okay, again, we've got quite a range of attitudes or behaviors there. Number 1 represents a kind of sense of boredom, perhaps, the idea of learning grammar. Number 2 is perhaps a more pragmatic attitude. Number 3 is this kind of an anxious student who feels that they're kind of missing out. And then obviously one of fear in the last behavior, the silent look of terror. So we'll stop that poll now. And again, if we look at student preferences, again, we can look at them in terms of a continuum from one of fear to one of slavish devotion. So often what tends to drive student preferences are prior learning experiences. So for example, students might have had to study grammar at high school or at a university before they joined our class. And they might have been taught a lot of grammar and found it difficult to understand, and therefore they have quite a negative attitude towards it. Whereas there are students who feel that, students have often said to me, I don't feel as though I really know a piece of language until I've actually, really understood the grammar. And once I've got on top of the grammar, I feel that I'm beginning to make progress. So they see grammar as some sort of safety net, and they feel that it's incredibly important in terms of making progress. So you've got a range of student preferences. So now let's look at grammar in course books. Most, not all, but most modern course books are underpinned by a grammar syllabus. So quite typically, a course book will begin with what are perceived as being more straightforward grammar points, and then they will move to grammar points that are a little bit more complex and difficult to understand towards the end of the course book. So in the first unit, for example, it might focus on the present simple, and then at the final unit of the course book, it might be dealing with something like the second conditional. The other thing is that often the lessons in course books, if you look at a unit, the first sort of 2 lessons in a unit will probably feature some kinds of grammar, okay? So that sends a kind of implicit message by front-loading the grammar in the unit that grammar is important. So it is quite a strong driver in course books. Grammar is usually contextualized in reading and listening texts. So this is, I think, where course books have got slightly better over the years. They don't tend to just have sentence level examples, but often the grammar is presented in a reading or in a dialogue or conversation of some kind. Typically, there's some kind of explicit focus on grammar structures, and it will, the activities in the course book will look at the form, the way the grammar is actually put together, and they'll also look at the use. The other thing is that grammar terminology is used fairly frequently. Terminology such as kind of main verb, auxiliary verb, ing form, past participle, etc. Most course books assume that students have got some kind of knowledge or awareness of this terminology. So what I'd like to do now is bring these 3 things together. So if we're looking at grammar in the classroom, we go into the classroom with our kind of attitudes, our feelings and opinions about grammar. Students arrive with their preferences, and then more often than not, teachers are using a course book of some kind. They may not be, they may be using their own material, but often, if not a course book, there are some kind of teaching materials which are likely to include some kind of focus on grammar. Now, if all of those 3 overlap, as they do at the very center of this diagram, well, I guess we're kind of in a pretty happy place. So, you know, the students' preferences and the teacher attitudes match, and the course book provides what you want. So that's kind of a happy situation. But I guess more typically that doesn't happen. There'll be some kind of disconnect in a way. So that means we kind of need to manage these conflicting agendas if there is kind of disagreement between what the student prefers, what you believe, and what the course book provides. My personal opinion is that it's difficult to ignore grammar altogether. In my experience, many students want it. Not all students, but a lot of students are particularly adult learners, they feel that it's kind of important to get their head around the grammar to some degree. Even if they don't like it, they will often say, I don't like grammar, but I do feel that it's important and that we need it. Another issue here is that your institution may require you to teach it. So there could be achievement tests that your institution has, which allows students to move from one level to another. And that means you need to actually teach some grammar in order for students to be able to perform successfully in these achievement tests. The other thing is, if you are using a course book, it's probably going to have grammar in it. And if you completely ignore the grammar, you are going to be you're going to have to ignore quite a large part of the coursebook, because as we've noted, that grammar often drives the syllabus in a course book. And students will often get maybe a little bit anxious or maybe a little bit annoyed if they feel that you're not sort of using the course book enough, and they may question, you know, what's the validity of this book that I'm having to bring to class every day. So I think that in terms of managing these conflicting agendas, I think probably the onus is on us, the teachers, to try and be a little bit flexible. I think that, you know, when all is said and done, students' needs and their preferences are probably a little bit more important than our attitudes. Sometimes we have to compromise. But the key thing is that I think the reason that we can be flexible is that we do have the opportunity of choosing different ways of dealing with grammar in the classroom, so that we can actually tailor things a little bit to the students' needs, a little bit maybe even to our own beliefs. So we do have that choice to be flexible. So I think that because of the choices that we can make, and that's what I want to kind of focus on for a lot of the webinar, the kind of choices, the kind of things that we can do. So let's start with a little bit of methodological theory, if you like. So I think that this is quite a good quote from Jack Richards. He says, current approaches to grammar and language teaching today vary from those that can be referred to as grammar first to those that can be characterized as grammar last, as well as a range of positions in between. So again, I mean, although I haven't done a diagram for this one, you've got this sort of sense of a continuum from grammar first to grammar last. So grammar first is a situation where we kind of present grammar up front. Okay, we introduce it into the lesson. Whereas grammar last is probably where we're doing some kind of communicative activity, and we see what language students use, and then we sort of go back to the grammar, and that's kind of last. So the grammar first position is often associated with what we call PPP, presentation, practice, production. So I want to look at that first of all, and that's where we're going to look at sort of a range of different ideas or alternative activities that you could follow. So if we look at the kind of the grammar first approach, these two terms are used, a deductive approach to teaching grammar and an inductive approach to teaching grammar. Now, numbers 1 and 2 here are definitions of those two terms. So number 1, examples of the grammar point are given to students and the rules are explained. It could be a written or a spoken explanation, or students are given input containing grammar and examples and encouraged to discover the rules for themselves. So Steve, if you could run the poll, what I'd like you to do is select which term matches which definition. So I'll just give you a moment to read these and then you can vote for. Okay, so looking at the poll, it's the last two definitions for deductive and inductive that are most popular. Okay, so this is in fact how it stacks up. So deductive is the version where the rules are given, and inductive is the approach where rules are discovered. Now, I have to say that when I first learnt these terms years ago, I struggled with them because in fact they're counterintuitive. Deductive seems to suggest that the students are deducing, and therefore it gives this idea of working out, but in fact the opposite is true. So they are kind of quite tricky terms, these two. So deductive is where the teacher is giving rules or explaining rules, and inductive is where the students induce the rules from examples. But it is slightly odd, slightly counterintuitive terminology, and it yeah, tripped me up when I first learnt those terms or focused on them. So let's just have a look at some some variations. Although they are kind of two approaches, there are slightly different ways of tweaking them. Excuse me. So one possibility, I mean, I've just given 3 example variations. There are doubtless more, but let's just have a look at these. So with the first one, the teacher writes up examples on the board and just merely explains the rules, just gives the rules. Or another possibility, students read some grammar reference material. So for example, often in the back of course books, there is a kind of a grammar section that explains rules and gives examples and has tables of form, etc., etc. So they could read something like that. And then the teacher does a backup explanation and checks if students understand. They might just say, okay, do you understand that? Or they might ask more targeted questions. Or another third possibility is that students study highlighted examples in the text and the teacher explains how the grammar is used. So often in maybe a reading text, there could be examples of modal verbs and these could be yellow highlighted, and the teacher then goes through and explains, okay, you've got this can is used for possibility, etc., etc., etc. So those are variations in the inductive and the deductive approach. In the inductive approach, here are another 3 example variations. Students notice examples of a grammar point in a text and they work out how it's used. So the teacher might just say, okay, look at these examples. How do you think, what is this particular grammar point being used to express? Why is it being used in this way? Or the teacher could write examples on the board and then ask concept questions. So rather than explain the meaning, the concept questions would ideally guide the students to an understanding of that grammar point. Another possibility, and I think this third one is quite a common approach in course books, that students do some kind of student-centered guided discovery task that focuses on the way a grammar point is used in the text. So often they'll look at the language and then do some kind of task, which they might work on their own and then perhaps talk about together in pairs. So these are 3 possible variations in terms of an inductive approach to teaching grammar. But the 2 can actually also work in tandem. I mean, they're not mutually exclusive necessarily. So here I've just kind of outlined 4 steps in a lesson where a teacher is kind of using both inductive and deductive approaches to dealing with grammar. So students notice grammar examples in a reading text. So the teacher might point out one example and get them to look for more examples of that, say there could be a tense, so find more examples of the present perfect. They complete some kind of student-centered task that clarifies the meaning and the form. So it could be the student-centered task could be questions or matching or something along those lines. The teacher does feedback on the task, and then maybe she'll write up more examples on the board and explain these examples. And then the teacher perhaps rechecks the meaning and form using oral concept questions. So here you've got a little bit of student discovery. Students think about it for themselves, but the teacher is also explaining and then also checking meaning using questioning techniques. So it's kind of blending the 2 together. And often when I've had occasion to observe teachers teaching a grammar lesson, often it is something along these lines where there's a little bit of student-centered activity, but there is also some teacher explanation. So typical coursebook methodology, if it's kind of followed strictly, is that students listen to a text that contains examples of the target grammar. So the grammar is contextualized in some way. The target language is highlighted. So the course book itself might do it, as I mentioned just before, with maybe some kind of highlighting, or the students themselves may need to go through and highlight it or underline. Students complete the tasks that focus on form and meaning. Then often a teacher might also practice an aspect of pronunciation associated with the target grammar. So, for example, if you're teaching the present perfect, one of the things that you might want students to do in terms of pronunciation is make sure that they're using the contraction. So you might drill some examples. And then that is usually followed by some kind of written or spoken practice. So this adheres very much to what I would call a PPP, presentation, practice, production approach to teaching grammar. And it's quite typical in course books. The kinds of tasks that are quite common in course books that look at form and meaning. There could be oral or there could be written concept questions. So you may create your own oral concept questions, or they may be suggested by the teacher's notes in a course book, or there could be concept questions that have actually been written into the student's book, and students answer those questions and perhaps talk about them in pairs. Often coursebooks might ask students to complete a sentence or to complete a rule. There could be a kind of a gap, and they actually have to add a word or a phrase in the gap to complete a rule, which explains the meaning. Or they could be asked to choose the correct option. There could be, say, 2 words in italics, and they could, you know, the present perfect refers to, in italics would have past or present, and they have to choose which time zone is correct, something along those lines. Often students have to match descriptions of meaning to examples. If they're focusing on form, they often perhaps have to fill in some kind of formula or grid or something along those lines. So by formula, I mean something like subject plus auxiliary verb plus main verb, etc. They have to fill in something along those lines. Or maybe the teacher will have to elicit form onto the board. So this is the final task, the final poll that we'll run. So what I'd like you to do is choose 2 of your preferred ways of dealing with language in the classroom, of these different activities. So Steve, if you could run the poll, that would be great. So maybe choose one way that is associated with meaning and one that is associated with form. So if you could vote. Okay, so I'm not sure if you can see the poll, but it's quite interesting. The first and the last are the 2, I mean, there's a reasonably even spread, but concept questions and elicitation of the form onto the board are quite popular, the 2 most popular. And then the third would be in matching examples, descriptions of meaning. The least popular option there is completion of form formulas, which yeah, doesn't surprise me at all. Okay, so yeah, obviously there's no right or wrong answer to this. It's purely just yeah, what your preferences are. And I mean, obviously there's probably other ways that you deal with grammar that I haven't included here, but I think these are fairly typical in terms of teachers I've observed and coursebook activities. So looking at these different approaches, particularly the coursebook-based ones, and thinking about strengths and weaknesses. So the grammar examples come from a context. I think this is a good thing. Certainly when I first started teaching, a lot of grammar examples were just sentences, and they didn't come from a context. And it sometimes was quite difficult to really deal with meaning in a successful way because there was no context to refer back to. So that was a little bit frustrating. And I think that coursebooks have improved in this regard. Often the actual sequencing of tasks is reasonably logical. It seems to be more typical to deal with meaning before form. And that makes sense. It's a good idea that students understand what the grammar is before they actually look at, how it's made. The approach with the different activities and tasks that are provided do provide opportunities for student-centered interaction, and I think that is a good thing. And generally, there is kind of thorough coverage of meaning and form. It gives students a reasonably clear idea. However, I think that sometimes students' specific grammar needs are not fully addressed, and I think that the methodology that is provided in coursebook is kind of very heads down. So what I want to move on to now is looking at some specific issues, I think, with both meaning, form, and practice. And this is where I just want to share some ideas with you of how you can sort of approach dealing with meaning or dealing with form or doing a practice activity in a slightly different way. Now, these are just ideas that I'm sharing. They may not work for you, but even if they don't work for you, they might actually trigger another idea. And you might sort of think, okay, that wouldn't work so well, but if I tweak it in this way, and that really is the aim. I'm not saying these are the answers, it's just sharing some ideas. So looking at the first issue is associated with meaning. I think that's often with the kind of the matching activities where they have to look at an example of a grammar point and then match it to a description of meaning. Students are often quite good at that, and they can often do it quite successfully and quite quickly. They're often also very good at answering concept questions. And I think sometimes they're good at answering concept questions because our intonation and our delivery of the concept question sort of gives the game away, that they kind of know what question, which of the answers we're after. So sometimes I feel that students' understanding or their kind of grip on meaning in terms of particularly as, mapping the right form to the right meaning when they actually need to produce it is a little bit tenuous and just maybe a little bit superficial sometimes. So this is one idea of dealing with meaning in a slightly more challenging way, perhaps. And it asks them to it asks you, the teacher, to actually work from meaning rather than working from form. So the way it works, I'll just talk you through it. Students complete a task, a sort of a typical task, concept questions or something like that, that focuses on meaning. And then what you do is you tell them sentences and that you want them to write sentences or questions, and they should use their own personal information in doing so. And that when they write a sentence, they should use the pronoun I, and when they write a question, they can use the pronoun you. And then you say each sentence 2 or 3 times, and they write an example. So as you can see, there are 4 examples here. So this is looking at a lesson where you would be teaching present simple and then contrasting it with the present continuous. So you're looking at this difference between the two. So these are the kind of the call outs are the 4 bullet pointed sentences, and this is what you say to students. Write a sentence about a hobby you always do. So therefore you're wanting them to write something, they want an example using the present simple. Write a question about another person's activity now. So there you want the present continuous. Write a sentence about food or drink now. You want them to write a sentence about, I'm having breakfast, I'm eating a sandwich. And then write a question about something a person does every day. So in a way, this is a kind of dictation, but you're getting students to come up with examples. And your point of departure here is not saying write examples of the present simple and present continuous. You're actually just giving meaning, these meaning call outs. So you'd need to repeat each one 2 or 3 times probably, and then don't get students to check at this point, once you've actually finished all of the call outs, and I'm suggesting here you maybe do 4 or 5 of these, then they can actually check their examples together and see if the grammar matches up in some ways, and you can monitor and help and correct. And then in terms of a kind of a feedback activity, you could go around and get pairs to give examples maybe that they're not sure about, and you can give feedback on those. So what I'm suggesting here is working from meaning and getting students to produce examples rather than working from form. And this is an activity I call meaning call out. So a second issue I think is associated with grammar form. Students are often very good at rattling off form rules. You know, they can often go subject plus, have, has, plus, past participle, and they can say that very quickly and very easily. But if you want them to actually use the present perfect and write it correctly, and again, to use it when in the right situation with the correct meaning, they're often less successful. So that's one issue. And a second issue with form is I'm often surprised by the things that puzzle students. So I think maybe this has something to do with the learner's first language, but things that seem quite straightforward can often be quite perplexing. And sometimes it's difficult to predict exactly what students are going to be struggling with in terms of form. It's often surprising. The other issue is that a lot of form activities are a little bit boring. Now, it was quite telling in the poll that the form-based activity of, you know, filling out formula was the least preferred option, and I sympathize. So I've got a couple of ideas for dealing with form in a slightly different way. So the first one is what I call table assembly. So the students complete the grammar tasks in the lesson, and then you ask them to close their books. What you then do is hold up a series of cut-ups, and what the cut-ups are is in fact a grammar form table. I'll show you an example in a minute. And what you ask them to do is to reassemble the table so that it summarizes the form of a grammar structure with maybe, you know, the affirmative, negative, and interrogative forms of a tense. And I think it's a good idea if this is something that students do in a small group of maybe 3 or 4, and they organize the cut-ups into the table. And when most groups are finished, they can actually maybe check their table against the example in the course book, or you could get students to kind of stand up and wander around, and they could look at each other's tables and see if, you know, if they match, if they're the same. They could give feedback to each other. That would make things a little bit more interesting. And then once students have checked in the course book, you could do some kind of feedback on the form task. So this is the kind of table that I mean. Now, what I recommend quite strongly is that you don't just photocopy the table, because you can see that this is formatted with the different sort of parts of the table have all got different sizes. So students could actually just reassemble it just as they would with a jigsaw puzzle without actually thinking about what's in the squares. So what you would need to do is reformulate it, retype it into a grid like this so that all the squares are more or less the same size, and there's no coloring to indicate what goes where. So I think you need to make it sort of neutral in this way. So rather than getting students just to silently read one of these tables or talking through it or explaining, this kind of table assembly turns it into a little bit more of a task, and maybe gets them thinking about form in a different way. The next idea, the second idea in terms of dealing with form, is students' own questions. Now, students can complete the grammar book tasks and then get them to look for more examples in the text that you've used. So it could be a reading or a listening audio script, and get them to underline those examples, find more examples. And then I'd put students into groups of 3 and 4, and they should come up with their the questions that they want to ask you about the grammar point. So I've suggested that this is done with form. There's no reason why you couldn't also do this particular activity with meaning as well. Students might need a little bit of support, as it's suggested in point 4 here. You might want to just write some useful phrases, depending on the grammar point that you're looking at, some kind of question stems of this nature that might help them formulate the questions. And you might want to give them, as it suggests in point 5, some kind of key grammar terminology if they are less comfortable with this. And then allow students about 10 minutes to come up with their own questions, and then do feedback. And basically they ask you the questions as opposed to you asking them. So it's actually flipping it around in that way. What's interesting about this activity when I've done it is that when students are working in their groups, often they're quite successful at teaching each other. So a stronger student will often be able to help a weaker student. And it's also quite, this is, where it's quite revealing, as I mentioned before, what puzzles students about form sometimes. The other thing I would say about this activity, obviously, is that it does assume that you have prepared your answers. So whatever grammar point you're dealing with, you need to make sure you've done your research, that you're able to answer their questions. Okay. The final issue, and the third and final issue, is associated with grammar practice. So a lot of course books have controlled practice after students have analysed form and meaning. There's some kind of controlled practice activity. More often than not, that is maybe a gap-filling, sentence completion, choosing the correct form kind of activity. There is less provided in course books in terms of controlled spoken practice. And the reason for that is it's actually often very difficult to represent that on the page. That can be quite hard. So if students are doing a kind of a heads down analysis of meaning and form, and then they do a heads down gap filling sentence completion activity, that's a lot of heads down activity in one stretch of classroom time. That could mean, 20, maybe even 30 minutes of heads down activity. Okay, a little bit of checking in pairs. Obviously, perhaps with a grammar point, there is an opportunity for doing some kind of role play with a freer oral practice. But often students aren't ready to do something freer when they've just analysed the language, and they do need that sort of controlled practice. So this is a very simple idea of turning controlled written practice into something that is a little bit more oral, and it gets students up and moving around. So what you can do is you can give each student in your class a sentence with a gap sentence that you might have just actually taken from the course book and typed out. They look at their sentence, they fill in the gap. Don't get them to check with each other, but give them the correct answer on the reverse side. So they can just flip over the sentence and find the correct answer there. Then what you ask them to do is get up and move around the classroom. And what they do is they read or say their sentences to each other. And where there is a gap, rather than using the correct word, the example I'm giving here is say can and can't, with a maybe if you're teaching ability, can and can't for ability at A2 level. So rather than saying the word that goes in the back, they just say beep or gap or something like that to signal that's where a word needs to go. And the person they're speaking to listens, and then they have to think what the correct answer is and say it, and then the student with the sentence can confirm, say yes, that's correct or not. If you're going to try this, a key thing that you need to do is monitor quite attentively, or first of all, give instructions quite clearly, and tell them not to show their sentences to each other. Because if they do, basically they're just reading each other's sentences, and it just really, it's not that different from if they'd just actually done the examples in the course book. So you need to make that very clear in the instructions, and you need to monitor quite attentively to make sure that they are not just holding up their sentences, that they actually have to say it or read it aloud and listen to each other. So one of the good things about this, it does actually encourage students to listen to each other. Sometimes, you know, some classes are not very good at doing that. So it does actually encourage them to listen in. So the example I'm giving here with can and can't would be a low level class. With a higher level class, you could actually ask them to memorize the sentence and actually take the piece of paper away, and that would force them to listen. And you can do some kind of feedback, ask who got a lot of correct or incorrect answers. And if you did feel that students still need a little bit more reinforcement in some written practice, they can still do the written practice activity afterwards as kind of consolidation. So that's the third idea. So in all of these ideas, what I've been trying to do is this idea of just trying to get grammar off the page a little bit with you know, a lot of heads down activity. So I just would like to look at some sort of broader principles of what I mean by getting coursebook activities off the page. So where possible, provide a student-centered focus, pairs, groups, mingles, etc. Look for opportunities to provide that. Get students talking about grammar. So, I mean, this is where the coming up with questions for form was quite important. Provide students with a degree of control, an opportunity for them to tap into their needs. So again, the students writing their own questions is quite good. Trying to make sure there's a degree of challenge. I mean, a manageable challenge, obviously, but I mean, the very first activity, the meaning call out, I think does create challenge for students. And I think that can be beneficial from time to time. And if possible, try to look for a way to get students up and moving. So these are kind of 5 principles that I would suggest if you're looking at grammar activities and trying to think, how can I get them off the page? So these are 5 things to think about associated with that. Now, just before we finish, I'd just like to, this is kind of a reminder going back to the Jack Richards quote. We've looked a lot at the grammar first methodology. The grammar last methodology is also another way, I think, of getting grammar off the page. And this is just a reminder. I think this is, this approach is also known as task, teach, task. And the way that you can do task, teach, task, if you're using a course book, is in fact to go to the end of the lesson and do the freer oral activity first. So the activity where you hope students are going to be using the target grammar, do that first. Listen in, see if they're using the target language that they should be using. Now, if they are, that's great. You don't actually need to teach it. If they're using it, move on to something else. Teach them some vocabulary, something else that that would be useful for them to learn. If not, and this tends to be the case, that they are not using the grammar point that you think that the activity ideally requires them to use, what you can then do is listen for some examples of their emergent language and give them feedback on this, and say, okay, can we say this in a slightly different way and see if you can elicit the target grammar, which will make the message a little bit clearer and maybe a little bit more accurate. And then you can go back and, in effect, cherry pick from the course book the activities that are going to be most beneficial. Do they need to look at the reading text where there are more examples? Will that help them? Is the issue one of form or is it one of meaning? Which of the activities do you need to focus on more? And then you can actually get students to redo the same activity that they started with, but put them in a new pair with a new partner. Or you can actually find another activity which is similar and get them to do that as the kind of the second task, the third step in the process. So task, teach, task, this grammar last approach also is a way of getting grammar off the page. So we've come to an end of the seminar, and this is just a reference of the quote I shared with you. So I'm going to open the question and answer and see if I can actually answer any of your questions. So let's see, what order do they appear in? So the first question I can see here, we are increasing moving to closing classrooms and teaching online under the current world pandemic. What's your advice for doing all this online? I don't have a lot of advice. I'm going to be perfectly honest here. Since the pandemic arrived, I have not been teaching, so I actually don't have a lot of experience teaching online, and I feel loath to actually give advice on teaching online. I think that probably a lot of these activities could be adapted. I mean, for example, the meaning call out, I don't see why you couldn't do that online. It's a little bit more difficult with the ones where you're actually getting students to mingle in a physical space. So for those of you who are teaching online, I would suggest that you sort of take what you can from this, but I am loath to actually give you advice because I suspect you're probably far more expert than I am at the moment because I haven't been in the situation of having to teach online. Okay, then the next question is, do you have some further suggestions on the best way to assess grammar and ensure students can use it in a functional way rather than just knowing the rules and the theory? So yes, I do. In effect, it's good if you can actually get students to do activities, communicative activities, where they should ideally use a grammar point. So it could be a discussion, it could be a role play. And the idea is that you would listen in. Now, I know that can be quite tricky in terms of how you manage and set it up. And one of the ways that I experimented with last year, at the beginning of last year, is I would get students to do role plays where I actually wanted to, I mean, I wasn't just assessing grammar, I was assessing their speaking, but assessing their grammar in terms of using it in this functional way, rather than just spouting rules and theory, was part of that. So in pairs, I would get them to record their role play and conversation using a mobile phone. And then I got them to upload it to, I was using Edmodo at that point, and then I would actually listen to the role play or the discussion or whatever it is, whatever speaking activity, and then I would listen out for grammar points that they would use. The reason I got them to record it is I often find it quite difficult to be able to hear all students all the time. So with a class of 14, that's 7 conversations in pairs, that I actually found easier. I found it easier to listen in later on, and it was, you know, it was not that different from actually assessing or marking students' work, written work, and that does give an opportunity for you to listen in and give feedback. You can take your time. You can isolate particular examples where they perhaps are using the grammar point successfully, and others where they're not, and give them feedback on that. So that's a way that I've done that, and that's a suggestion in terms of the recording of students. Okay, so a question here from Susan. What's your view of teaching past perfect and pre-intermediate? At intermediate level, they never seem to get it. That's true. That's often very, very true. One thing that I've over the years, one of the conclusions that I've come to, unfortunately, is that there is often not a direct relationship between teaching and learning. So when you teach a grammar point, it doesn't mean that students are automatically going to learn it. And I think that this becomes more the case when the grammar is more complex with something like the past perfect. And it's one of those issues where you just need to keep coming back to it again and again and again. And, you know, giving students giving students reminders, feedback when they, in terms of correcting them with the past perfect. I don't think there's any kind of silver bullet. I think it requires patience and persistence. And at a certain point, students will get it. There's kind of that magic moment, and I'm sure, you know, as teachers, you've seen it when there's an expression on the student's face when the penny kind of finally drops, and then you get a sense of them beginning to actually be able to use a new grammar point. And I think that's you just need to be patient for that moment. But I mean, I also appreciate the frustration. I've experienced it myself, where, you know, you've taught a very solid lesson on a particular grammar point, and it all seems to be fine. And then when it comes to the freer oral practice activity, where you haven't told them to use it, but you would like them to be using it, they're not. And I just think that is in the nature of second language learning and acquisition. And it's this kind of recursive approach to teaching grammar, of coming back to points, providing them with opportunities to use that target language, that eventually that they will get there. So I don't have a quick and easy fix. My advice is patience. Okay. All right. So, yes, so a comment here where it talked about, where it goes back to the very first activity. Students choose if students hate to learn grammar or they want to learn grammar. I think that native English speakers don't like to learn grammar, but international students would like to learn about grammar, because grammar would help them to speak, write, and do their assignments. I think that often is the case. I think that not all teachers, but a lot of teachers, native speakers, when they do an initial teacher training course, it's often perhaps the first time they've had to engage with English grammar in an explicit way, and that they are a little, maybe initially very uncomfortable with it. I mean, often, I certainly was when I first started. I actually quite like grammar now. I find it quite interesting. But I do agree with you that a lot of native English speakers do sometimes feel uncomfortable with grammar, and they don't like it. And I agree with you that, you know, for a lot of international students, adult learners in particular, learning about grammar is important, because ultimately, if a student has good implicit grammar knowledge and they can deploy a range of structures, they're able to refine their message, make it more sophisticated, express a greater variety of meanings. So it's 4 o'clock. So I think at this point, I'm going to have to finish. So I would like to thank you all very, very much for having listened and participated. And I'd like to thank you for your questions. I'd also like to remind you that this is the first in a series of webinars. So Nigel and Steve from Cambridge University Press will be in touch with you about further webinars in the series. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope that you've got some ideas that can help you get grammar off the page. Thank you very much.